social advocate sort of way, which at the time, on a very limited budget, I decided to buy a van as an 18-year-old and travel directly to communities and set up spaces and workshops where people could come and feel safe to speak their truth. Very simple concept, basically circle work. Here's a safe space. No one's going to give you advice. No one's going to tell you what to do. This is just a space to speak your truth and transcend the fear and the secrecy and the shame of what you're experiencing. After doing that for a year, things really started to snowball. Not only had, by this point, it gone from me to a team of 4 and 2 vans and 2 dogs. We had traveled in that year to 200 communities. We'd spoken over 150 schools, and we had an impact on over 50,000 people. And we had communities inviting us to come and hold this space. And some of the feedback we started to receive from community members and people that would participate in these circles were things like, I've had psychotherapies or various types of mental health support for decades, and nothing's even come close to how healing and therapeutic this experience was. And what I started to observe in my facilitation was the less I said, the less opinion I had, and the more open the space was, the more profound the transformation. And this really started to connect me to something very incredible about consciousness and conscious awareness and embodiment. All we need to heal is to be able to acknowledge what's trying to get our attention. And I thought back to that experience in my principal's office, and he saw me, he acknowledged what I was going through. So even though I didn't necessarily heal like that, there was a space, there was a possibility for me to lean into and walk that path of healing. And it really started to connect me to a much more quantum understanding of this existence, that we really are the conscious creator. But the more we interfere, the more we get in the way, the more we allow our judgments and our fears to interject, to put pressure on what it is we're wanting to call forward or become, the more and more difficult it is to really connect to our true power, because human beings are insanely powerful. Your consciousness is insanely powerful. Like, the degree in which a human being is multidimensional is, our conscious mind, the English language is never going to be able to fully understand. It's an experience. And so this work had a very powerful trajectory. And I ended up traveling pretty much consistently from 18 to 22, holding these spaces and running these workshops, until I got to a point where I recognized this really needs to be heard by policymakers, because the more research I was doing, the more I was seeing, like, these guys are spending billions of dollars and every year the problem's getting worse. And my team and I were working in communities with the simplest model that you could imagine, but there's a power in that simplicity. There's a power in not overcomplicating it. And that's something that I still very strongly stand by in my leadership. It's why I speak the way that I do. It's why I ensure that the content I put out is very simple, because complication creates interference. And what we want is openness and clarity. And so I was looking at these policymakers, like, investing so much money, and yet every single year the problem was getting worse statistically. The results that we were having in communities were things like, in rural parts of Australia, for example, that had, 15, 20% attendance rate at their local schools, which was normal in some of these communities, which is insane when you think that Australia is a very affluent country. You don't think that these things go on, but they do in a lot of these communities that are so difficult for the government to service, to rectify. The cycle is so systemic, and I think this exists across the world in communities and areas that have intergenerational welfare. It's very difficult to break that cycle. And yet we were having these results. So an example would be, we would go into the school, we would create connections with those that would be there, which would be very few. And we'd literally just, no pressure, invite them to talk if they wanted to talk. And after 6 months, 12 months, some of these schools were starting to see an increase in their attendance by like 40, 60, 70, 80%. One of the most powerful conversations that I had with one of the students that actually identified immediately as the school bully, that's how they introduced themselves. When I asked her, why do kids not come to school? And her response to me was, the teachers will tell you we just don't care, but the truth is we're afraid because of the level of violence that exists within our community. So there was this segregation, the teacher's projection of, well, the kids just don't care, the service provider's projection of the kids just don't care, versus the reality of these students, these young people feeling not safe. And if you're not, how can you force someone to go into a space when they don't feel safe? Of course, there's going to be that conflict. And so really addressing that and being present with that, which takes a lot of patience, it takes a lot of willingness, it takes a lot of embodiment to really hear that and to not blame and to not get frustrated, but to actually be with the reality of how things are and acknowledge the reality of how things are and help everyone feel seen in where things are at, so that there's an opportunity for that to evolve and change. And this work started to really create itself. That system of creating safe spaces for people to come and speak their truth slowly started to become community development projects and capacity building projects, where it was the sort of work a community would call and say, we've had an increase in our suicide rate significantly in the past 6 months. Can you come and help us? So very wicked problems, complex problems that really didn't have any directive from the community. But using this same system, we would go into the community, we would look at all of the stakeholders of the community. So it could have been the parents, the teachers, the students, the service providers, the council members, so on. And we would spend a whole day just listening to each stakeholder group. So we'd have a series of questions. We would give no opinion. We would just listen, take notes, hear them, actively listen. Then at the end, when we had listened to all of the stakeholders, we would bring people together in a forum and we would feed back what we heard. And what would start to happen is they started to discover through that process of being seen and heard, actually the continuity and the consistency of what each stakeholder group wanted. And what the work kept informing me of was there's so much more of what makes us the same than what separates us. Fundamentally, there is so much more that unifies us as human beings than what segregates and separates us. So I put this in a document to send to our policymakers. Again, one thing led to the next, and I found myself running an event in Parliament House that was basically about love and the importance of choosing love. Again, very radical position to be taking at that age, saying that this is the solution. But I started to speak to some of those statistics, and the policymakers, the head of health in Australia at the time, was sort of blown away by this, because never before had they considered prevention and early intervention and community development and cultural development potentially having a positive impact on some of these really detrimental statistics that were present in health. And so that's how I became the commissioner, and I was advising a $40 billion budget. So I went from living in my van, not really owning shoes, to then being escorted onto planes, being referred to as Commissioner Gibson. That was a wild trip. And again, just when you keep following your heart and staying true to yourself, that I think is the sort of gateway that love consistently will open up for you, because it's not about you. And that's what I've learned about love, is love is my God, and God has a will. And when you put your hand up and you say, I'm willing to be an instrument for that greater will, then your success really is inevitable. You need to be able to really embody that and be devotional in that. At least that's been my experience. But the more that I've trusted in that and listening's been a huge part of that journey, the more that I've always been put on the right journey and trajectory. So 4 years working in that space, seeing that Australia, and then also looking conjunct in the other Commonwealth budgets, pretty much it was a range of between 90 and 97% of these budgets were investing in crisis intervention. So I want to make a point of this because it spoke to something that is very present in all of us on an individual level. Our government and their budgets, 97 odd percent of that budget was going towards crisis intervention, meaning no money was spent until the problem was so bad that it was at a point of crisis. So it was a completely reactionary system. But this system is a macro manifestation of how so many of us live our lives individually. We wait for things to get so bad before we actually start to address and be present with what's present. So how do we change this? How did I change this in government? How can we change this as individuals? We need to actually make space to listen. And it's almost like an underwhelming realization, you know, like how do you change the world? Stop trying to change it and just start listening and be responsive to what's right in front of you. Because I feel like we have a lot of leaders that are so invested in making impact on billions of people that they're not being present with the person right in front of them. And so this systemic disconnection just goes on and on and on and on and on. Because how we really change the world is through each other and being present with one another, first with ourselves, and then with those who are right in front of us.